You're listening to the Useful Science Podcast, produced in collaboration with the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center. This week we're talking about antibiotics. Useful Science is a website where we post one-sentence summaries of scientific research relevant to your everyday life. On this podcast, we bring on a rotating panel of our science contributors and pick out a few items from the Useful Science archives and dive deep into them. So while the website gives you the short, tweetable version of scientific research, our goal here is to give you the full story. Let's meet our hosts for this week.
Hi, my name is Susan Rogers Van Ketwijk, and I am an investigator at the Global Strategy Lab at York University in Toronto, where I focus actually on antibiotic resistance and what different countries and governments around the world can do to address that.
Hi, I'm Avnish Nadla. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, San Diego in the physics department. I specialize in theoretical biophysics and have a lot of different projects, but currently the ones that I'm focusing on are on bacteriophysiology and on microbial ecology.
My name is Cameron Spencer. I'm not a scientist. I'm a web designer and a web developer, and I work on the Useful Science website. So Susan, let's dive into your article.
Yeah, okay. So the summary from the Useful Science website is that antibiotic use in animals raised for food is drastically increasing. This poses a risk for antibiotic resistance, which may limit our capacity to treat infectious diseases. So the paper I'm looking at is called Global Trends in Antimicrobial Use in Food Animals, and it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015 by Thomas Van Boekel and Ramanan Laxminarayan and others from Princeton and the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics, and Policy in Washington, D.C. And basically what the article is about is that as more people around the world become more wealthy, there's an increased demand for meat. And to keep up with that demand, you see sort of intensified agriculture. And one of the things that's happened alongside of that is that to try to keep animals growing quickly, growing in crowded conditions, farmers have started giving antibiotics to their livestock. And that's not done so much to treat animals that are already sick, but sort of dosing an entire herd of animals to prevent illness or try to promote faster growth so you can get meat to market faster. What they did in this study was to estimate the global average annual consumption of antimicrobials per kilogram of animal produced for cattle, chicken, and pigs. And so antimicrobial is sort of a broad word for a drug that kills or stops the growth of microbes. So antibiotics are antimicrobials that kill bacteria, whereas antifungals are antimicrobials that kill fungi, and antiparasitics kill parasites. So in this study, once they estimated how much antimicrobials were used to produce cattle, pigs, chickens, they then figured out how changing patterns of meat consumptions around the world would change antibiotic use. And they did some math modeling to figure out that between 2010 and 2030, antibiotic use for livestock would increase by somewhere around 67%. And that increase would be driven by, first, an increased demand for meat, and second, more farmers moving over from traditional agricultural practices to sort of intensified agricultural practices that would involve giving antibiotics to their livestock. The other interesting thing that they found in that study was that for the group of countries that we call the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the increase in antibiotic use will be 97%, which is 7 times the projected population increase. So it's not just about more people wanting to eat more meat, but also about this shift from not using antibiotics to starting to use antibiotics when growing livestock for meat consumption.
Why do we talk about those 5 countries in particular? Because they're growing economies?
They're growing economies, growing populations, growing sort of importance.
What was it? Brazil, China, India, South Africa. There was one more, wasn't there?
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Because it's not a regional thing.
No, they didn't focus much on Russia. As somebody from one of the BRICS countries, in general, the other 4 are considered the rise of the global south. So a lot of the development that had usually taken place in the global north earlier are now taking place in Brazil, China, India, and because of the large population of these countries, it's considered significant.
Maybe those are the fastest growing populations, although I don't know if Russia has a fast growing population.
I think it's more fastest growing economies.
Okay.
Yeah, so why does increasing antibiotic use in animals actually pose a problem then? Basically, antibiotic resistance is when bacteria become resistant to the drugs that we use to treat them. And bacteria have genetic differences between them that mean that some bacteria are always going to be a little bit more resistant to antibiotics than others. So when you treat an infection with antibiotics, there's always a chance that some of the more resistant bacteria are going to survive and pass on their genes to future generations of bacteria. That's important for a couple of reasons. It means that any time you use an antibiotic, there is a risk of antibiotic resistance. Whether or not it was an appropriate, good use of antibiotics, there's just that little risk there. And it means you have to start balancing all of these different factors in terms of whether you should be using an antibiotic or not. So a resistant bacteria is more difficult to treat and more expensive to treat. And so recently, because of the growth of antibiotic resistance, there are actually people who have died from infections that, say, 20 years ago were totally treatable, easy infections to deal with. And now we're at this point where there's at least been suggestions that antibiotic resistance could end up causing more deaths per year than, say, HIV did in the early 2000s, or more deaths than we would expect to see from cancer. And along with that, lots of significant economic costs that come from people being ill and being in hospital longer and being off work longer, and all sorts of challenges that just come from that. The other problem is that antibiotics aren't a drug that's like specific to a single bacteria. So when you take an antibiotic, you'll treat the infection that was making you sick, but you also end up having these side effects on all of the other bacteria that are in your body. And you can cause resistance to develop in those other happy gut bacteria that just sort of live with you all the time. And on top of that, bacteria also share information back and forth with each other. So when there is a bacteria that's resistant, they have the ability to also pass on that information and tell other bacteria how to be resistant to an antibiotic. And then the third problem is a lot of the antibiotics we use in animals are the same antibiotics we use in humans. So if we give antibiotics to animals, we're increasing the chance that we could end up with some resistant bacteria causing illness in humans later.
Susan, I had a quick question. When you talk about antibiotics, a lot of the focus seems to be on bacteria, but generally the word itself would seem to describe other microbes as well.
Yes, so we talk a lot about antimicrobial resistance, and that is bacteria being resistant to antibiotics and viruses being resistant to antivirals and parasites being resistant to antiparasitics. So when we're thinking about the sort of big global health threat, the thing that's really important and looming at the moment, we're often talking about bacteria being resistant to antibiotics, these sort of superbugs. And there are problems with sort of other antimicrobials as well, but the one we're really focused on is bacteria.
Is this because of phenomena such as horizontal gene recombination gene transfer that you were talking about, or just generally because bacteria are more prevalent?
It's largely because we spent many decades using antibiotics for absolutely everything, oftentimes when there wasn't a really good reason to be using them. So there are times when you use an antibiotic because it's going to save a life or enable you to treat a cancer patient or something like that. And that's the best time to use an antibiotic. But we had this sort of golden age where there were tons of antibiotics and people really liked them and it seemed really easy. So they would just be given out for everything. And one of the problems was giving antibiotics out even though somebody might have a viral infection, and an antibiotic can't treat a virus. So we kind of got in this long-term habit of overusing antibiotics, and then the antibiotic development pipeline ran out of steam. And now we actually don't really have any new antibiotics coming down the pipeline. It's like, oh no, how do we actually manage to make sure that the antibiotics we've got are going to keep working for those life-saving applications if we keep doling them out for everything?
So when people buy organic food or when they try to avoid antibiotics in the food that they're buying, I think that they're probably mostly thinking about personal health effects, the healthfulness of that food that they're buying. Like, is that actually a factor or just more of an environmental issue?
I think there's probably some misconceptions around that and antibiotic use in humans. The important thing isn't so much that the food that you're eating would have antibiotics in it. It's that treating food animals with antibiotics increases the chances that there are going to be resistant bacteria floating around. So the larger problem is if you were to undercook a hamburger that had a bacteria in it that was resistant, or, cut raw meat and then cut vegetables on the same cutting board and end up with a bacteria that was resistant. Or even just, bacteria coming, as part of effluent and runoff, getting into water systems and into the soil, and just kind of increasing the amount of resistant bacteria in the environment that people and other animals could come in contact with and end up with a more serious infection.
Though, Cameron, what you mentioned also does happen. In fact, the paper cites a paper where they did see that from conventional chicken products, they were able to get bacteria that were resistant to a very common bacterium.
So is our consumer advice, eat less meat?
It might just be. What's actually really interesting is this paper came out maybe almost 5 years ago, and some countries have started really changing their rules around this. So antibiotic use in animals isn't as highly regulated as it is in humans. For us, at least in North America, most of Europe, you would have to go to a doctor, get a prescription, take that to a pharmacy. But farmers in North America and many other countries can just buy antibiotics without a prescription or anything like that. So what Europe has just started doing is having new rules that say, you can't treat animals with antibiotics without involving a vet and having a veterinarian decide that it's a good use of antibiotics. Say that you can't use any antibiotics in animals that are deemed to be like super medically important for humans. And also this kind of practice of giving antibiotics to a whole herd of animals, even if they're not even sick yet. They're trying to cut back on that and get to the point where you can treat a single sick animal, because from an animal rights, animal ethics kind of point of view, of course you want to treat sick animals and prevent illness and suffering. But you can't just dole out drugs preemptively in the hopes of bringing food to market faster.
Yeah, addressing the paper itself. So we knew about antimicrobial resistance in food animals because of giving antibiotics to them since the late 90s, early 2000s, if I'm not wrong.
Probably even longer than that, I would think.
Okay, and but this paper in 2014 was mostly trying to do a data analysis of showing where the microbial consumption and antimicrobial consumption is high, and showing what the trends will be in the future. But I found a lot of problems with the methodology of the paper, mostly because of a lack of data.
Yeah, so that's the biggest problem. There's not really an international system that has any sort of standardized data collection on antibiotic use in animals. And lots of the big pharmaceutical companies that sell antibiotics don't really want to give up that information too well. So one of the reasons this paper was so impactful when it came out in 2015 was it was kind of the first chance anybody had to do a really good estimate, but it's definitely an estimate. And if we had better data, we'd be able to look, at a lot of the gaps in the methods of this paper.
Okay. In particular, they were looking at the data from the top 20 economic countries, so 20 countries from OECD, and in particular, among those, most of them were from Western Europe, and not even certain states in the US, but across the US in general. And then they tried to extrapolate that to countries such as China and India. And I think that is not a very fair extrapolation to do just from statistical analysis.
Yeah. Getting good estimates is a real challenge, and it's hard to say what countries make good comparisons or good models for other countries. It's not easy.
Yeah, and I wonder with countries such as China and India, where there isn't a very strict enforcement of regulations. For example, I know that in India, many times what they do is they go to the pharmaceutical companies that are discarding expired or defective antimicrobial drugs, and they just sell them to poultry producers.
Wow.
And I don't know if that's in the books or if it'll ever be in the books, because it's just, and even if it is in the books, it's very difficult to regulate the amount that they're getting from these pharmaceutical companies. So I wonder how much of policy can really be implemented in these countries.
Yeah, it's very true. Every country, I mean, we all have our quirks with our systems, and so every country's policies to try and address this are going to end up being different. So I know here in Canada, they actually just closed a loophole because what most farmers would do is just drive down across the Canadian border into the United States and buy products with antibiotics for use in their animals, and then just bring them back across the border. And they've only just decided that, in fact, you're not allowed to just go buy antibiotics in the States and use them to treat, livestock in Canada anymore. So there's all sorts of interesting practices in antibiotics in animals.
And also, so it originated because it just had growth properties and they didn't really target the antibiotics at all, right?
Yeah, and it's really questionable whether it ever did have any sort of growth promotion properties. That was the claim for a long time, and so everybody jumped on board with that, but I think the evidence is starting to mount that giving animals low-dose antibiotics doesn't really help them grow faster.
Interesting. So what exactly accounted for the increase in growth production that they observed when they started using antibiotics?
I think it was probably a whole lot of intensified agriculture practices that came in at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you find any particular trends in the geography that are interesting regarding where they talked about these hotspots, and they talked about how certain animals are more prevalent in certain regions? Did anything strike out to you?
I'm not sure anything struck me as unusual. I think a lot of it makes a lot of sense. I spent some time living in China when I was younger. Obviously, China has a huge and growing population. And so it's not surprising to me that also as many people are becoming a lot more wealthy in China, and as the population is growing, they would be looking for ways to grow a whole lot more meat, a whole lot more quickly, and that antibiotic use would be part of that. Although it is interesting, I know that there was a little bit of consumer backlash in China a couple of years ago when I think some of the big American fast food chains were moving towards not having meat raised with the use of antibiotics in their North American outlets. And a lot of Chinese consumers were saying, hey, if you're changing your practices and the way you do this in the United States, how come you're not changing your practices over here as well? I don't know how that ever shook out in the end as to whether those big fast food outlets actually changed what they were doing in Asia or not.
Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay, great. Avanish, let's go to your article.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an extension of what Susan was talking about, where now scientists are finding that non-antibiotic drugs, or drugs that typically target human cells or the functioning of human cells, also has some antibiotic effects. So drugs such as anti-diabetics, proton pump inhibitors, and a whole sort that we generally take without thinking of them as antibiotics do have a significant effect on the composition of the gut microbiome. And over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a ton of research showing how the human gut microbiome is essential to a lot of different physiological processes. Not just digestive, but also it leading to hormone secretion and even psychological. So you have a huge difference in your emotions based on the gut microbiome that is present. So this is concerning for the primary reason that we take a lot of drugs that we think are inane, and in particular, even though in the last 10, 20 years, there's been a lot of movement away from prescribing antibiotics without the need for them, or even suggesting antibiotics but making sure that people complete the dose. You don't have a similar mentality regarding prescriptions from doctors for other drugs. And so this paper in particular says that we need to be more careful of that, because there are properties from other cells, other drugs as well. Does that make sense? Is there any question regarding that?
Meaning we should be more careful about over-prescribing these drugs?
Well, yes, overprescribing these drugs and also trying the dosage itself is something that is something that we need to be more careful about. But also, maybe we need to complete the dosage in a particular way. So if we prescribe a certain anti-diabetic drug and we know that it is going to tackle the bacteria in a certain way, that maybe it should be complemented with an antibiotic that would kill all of the bacteria rather than certain bacteria emerge with the resistance to the antibiotic drug itself and other antibiotics that you may consume later.
So that's really interesting. For a long time, the advice about antibiotics was that you had to finish the course of antibiotics, however many days that doctors said you had to take it. Mm-hmm. And within the last 5 years, they've actually gone away from making that recommendation because they were finding that was actually usually too long that people were taking antibiotics. So it'd be really interesting to think about these sort of other drugs and what impact they have on resistance. Because I'd be surprised to see them start saying that there was a full course you needed to take of other kinds of drugs. Should we explain what the microbiome is before we get too far into this?
Absolutely. I don't know if you want to do it or if I should.
Go for it.
Okay, so we have a ton of bacteria living within our system, a lot in our gut, but not just the gut. We have microbes living all through the body, and they are pivotal in many different parts of the human body and its functioning. And it's not just the digestive tract, as I was saying, but also in the endocrine system and the immune system. So when we think of our body acting independently, it's actually acting in concordance with a lot of other organisms that inhabit our body. But when we consume food or drugs, we often do not consider the effect that it has on those organisms that are essential to many functions in our body. Is there anything you would like to add, Susan?
No, that's all of it. There was a report that came out in Canada not that long ago talking about antibiotic resistance. And one of the things it was talking about was just how important it is to sort of protect your microbiome. Mm-hmm. All of these bacteria, they're in your body doing good things for your body. Mm-hmm. And so you got to try and figure out a way to make sure that you're not inadvertently harming those bacteria.
Yeah, and this is also part of the entire trend towards using probiotics, probiotic yogurt, probiotic drugs. I don't know if there's any scientific basis for that, but they drew a lot of the rationale from these gut microbiome studies.
Mm-hmm. So the study that you looked at, mm-hmm. were they doing this in the lab, or was this an epidemiological study? So
this was in the lab. This was all in vitro, so in petri dishes that they had, or well plates. But at the same time, they did look at epidemiological studies, and they found that the results that they had were consistent. So they looked at the symptoms that in vivo patients had, and they saw that the symptoms that they have from treatment from non-antibiotic drugs did have the effects from the antibiotic drugs that the same bacteria would have studied, if that makes sense. Should I repeat that in a more clear way?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I followed that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll repeat that. I realized it was a bit convoluted. So what they did was they identified certain drugs that impacted certain microbes, right? And so they made this huge map, which was that drugs A, B, C, and D impacted these microbes and so forth. And they found that 24% of the human targeted drugs impacted some microbes. But this is also an underestimate because they only tested, I think it was 700 microbes. But then if you test more against more microbes, then you're going to find that more drugs will have some effect on some of the bacteria. So definitely at least a quarter of the drugs we take do affect our gut microbiome. Now, the study that they did was purely in vitro, so in the lab, and they address this. They say there's a lot of complications which come with being in the body. For one, they were looking at isolates. They just took bacteria and they had only one in each plate, and then they put in the drug. Bacteria talk to each other, bacteria share a lot of information, so it's possible that when you have a lot of bacteria, then because of their collective information and collective action, they would not be affected by the drug that was given. So they address that, and also the fact that the human body itself could be helping the bacteria in some way. And they found that the side effects that you would expect from the antibiotic properties of these drugs. So suppose you found that this anti-diabetic drug was impacting the level of E. coli, and E. coli has certain side effects, or the absence of E. coli has certain side effects. They saw that side effect was also listed as a side effect of the anti-diabetic drug.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So it seems like there was almost this common knowledge that existed that there were these antibiotic properties of anti-diabetic drugs and all of these other drugs. We just didn't know that it was because of the antibiotic properties of these drugs.
So we had identified that there were side effects to drugs, but we hadn't realized that those side effects were because of their antibacterial effects.
Exactly.
Wow.
And all of their data is consistent with the side effects that they could find, but obviously they say that we need to do more tests to see that in vivo with patients, that is exactly what happens. I mean, they did a huge screen. They were looking at over 1,000 drugs, and they were looking at over 700 bacteria. So definitely, they could not have done this in humans themselves.
That would be a huge study.
Exactly.
I think the authors do a really good job in this paper. You know, they say that they're aiming to generate this resource of understanding the drug actions on the microbiome, but they do point out that this is that first in vitro look at things, and then you need to go and do the in-depth clinical trials and the mechanistic studies, because the kind of thing that you're talking about, with seeing those side effects. And the possible link to the antibiotic properties of, non-antibiotic drugs. It's not a strong enough link to say it's a cause, but it's a really good hypothesis to do a whole lot of research and learn a whole lot more stuff about it.
I should clarify, sorry, it was 1,197 compounds, and they looked at 38 species, but these 38 species are the most abundant in the human microbiome.
Yeah, that's still a big study.
Absolutely.
So I guess we're saying that this is an area that needs more research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. So one thing is regarding antibiotic resistance, they just talk about it at the end, but what could happen is that you're taking these anti-diabetic drugs and you don't really think about what that might have an effect on your future course of taking an antibiotic. But the parts of the human cells that they were targeting were actually the same parts of the bacterial cell that antibiotics target. So in the end, the drug that they give was targeting the bacterium in the same way that the antibiotic would.
I guess that shouldn't be surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. It's often very well conserved. So the bacteria could resist these the antibiotic effect of these drugs, and in as a consequence develop resistance to a lot of the antibiotics that are already present. In one sense, the terminology is confusing because they're claiming that human targeted drugs are antibiotic drugs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But probably not enough of an antibiotic drug to really be used as an antibiotic in the traditional sense.
Yes. Though they were looking at a very low dosage, and they still found a very high impact.
Interesting.
But it's not, they do feel that if you had even higher dosages, then they would probably have even higher impacts.
Should we wrap up? I don't want to cut you short if you have a...
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any other questions?
I don't think
I
so.
will say there are a few things about the paper that were interesting. They did not seem to differentiate by impact. So 203 drugs had an impact, but some of them may have had a larger impact than the others. So when I say a quarter, they really mean it could be that some of them are not that significant. Though all of them are statistically significant, they were using p-values to make sure that that's how they qualified something as having an impact or not. But they do not look at the magnitude of the impact.
Well, and that makes sense because there's statistically significant and then clinically significant. The kind of thing that would actually make a difference in a healthcare setting can be very, very different things. And of course, you're one step removed because you're doing this in the lab. But as you said, when you have all the interactions with the human body and with bacteria in the human body, the picture could end up looking totally different.
Yeah. And also, I should say that most of the drugs that they were looking at, they impacted only a few microbes. So out of the 38, maybe they impacted 3 or 4 of them, or even 1 or 2 in a lot of cases. But in most of these cases, the ones that they impacted were the most abundant in the gut microbiome. So their impact is significant. So the drugs that they were looking at are not broad target antimicrobial, but that the bacteria that inhabit our system seem to be susceptible to these drugs. And that might be because they inhabit our system. So because they are so closely linked to human cells that they are impacted by the same machinery that impacts human cells.
Cool.
So I have a question about statistics. So my understanding of a p-value is that that's a measurement of how much confidence we have that an effect exists, but not a measurement of the size of that effect. So something could have a small effect, but could still have a high p-value if we know that it's not just statistical noise. Is that correct? Or am I wrong about
Mostly.
To some extent, yeah. Impact is part of the assessment, but yes, the final statement you're making is agnostic of the impact.
Yeah, so something could have small effect but be statistically significant. The way p-values work is that smaller is more significant.
Okay, got
That's
it.
beside the point. But basically what a p-value is telling you is the probability of like getting the result that you saw just by chance.
Yeah.
So the analogy I like to use is if you were looking at a data set, then if you were to shuffle the data set many, many different times, how often would you end up with the classification that you wanted to state?
All right. I'm not sure I follow it.
I'm sorry if I ended up confusing you even more.
That's entirely possible.
I think what I wanted to clarify is that you were saying that they were looking for statistical significance. They were looking for significant p-values, I guess low p-values. But I was wondering if the effects could still be minuscule.
Yes. Okay, so I can clarify that. Let me see if I can go at it. Yes, statistical significance means that there is an effect that's probably not due to chance, but that doesn't mean that that's a big effect, and that doesn't mean that that's an effect that would have real-world consequences. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The p-value can't give you that piece of the information. It's kind of the extra bit that you add on to the estimate of the actual impact that you've already measured, just as sort of bonus information. We have the impact that we're estimating, and this is kind of how sure of that we are.
So, but impact does play into it because, for example, if you were looking at the growth of a certain microbial species, then there is going to be some degree of variance in the growth. Sometimes they grow a lot, sometimes they grow a little, even under the same conditions. So unless they are significantly impacted to some extent, that does not factor in. Otherwise, it would be probable under the variance that exists in normal growth conditions.
It's like signal versus noise. Like the bigger the effect is, the more easily we can distinguish it from the noise.
Absolutely, yeah, that is entirely it. Exactly, and so you could, if you had a perfect signal, then even if the impact is small, then you could say that it's statistically significant. But if you have a noisy signal, you need a big impact to show that it's statistically significant.
Yes.
Got it. That makes total sense. And it makes sense that when you're talking about bacteria growth, that it is not a clear signal.
Yeah, it is not a clear signal. So the impact they have is big. It's not huge, but it is big. It's definitely enough to show statistical significance. But at the same time, the threshold does not account for how big of an impact it is for different drugs.
Okay, let's wrap it up.
Let's do it.
Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. We always like to hear your feedback. Please email us at podcast@usefulscience.org, and you can reach us on Twitter at usefulsci. We also have a subreddit where we post the episodes for discussion, and we post other things that go on the website there. So that's at r/usefulscience is our subreddit. And we have a Facebook page. Just search Useful Science on Facebook and you'll find us. I want to thank our editor from Moorhead Planetarium, Vivian Lee, and I want to thank the composer of our new intro music, Solomon Krauss Imblock. He did a great job with that. My name is Cameron Spencer. You can follow me on Twitter at usonic, EUSONIC.
I'm Susan Rogers Van Kettwake. You can find me on Twitter at SusieRVK.
And I'm Avnish Narla.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a very useful week.